Because she's human, sir. The report hit the desk like a gunshot. Private Silas Vance. The colonel read aloud, his voice sharp as barbed wire. Charged with fraternization, dereliction of duty, and intent to marry an enemy national. The room fell silent, except for the hum of a ceiling fan spinning slow circles in the Texas heat. Across the table, Vance sat straight-backed in his khaki uniform, his hands rough and calloused from years on the ranch. "You gave her a ring?" the colonel asked. "Yes, sir. She's a prisoner of war, Private. Do you understand the seriousness of that?" Vance's jaw tightened. "Yes, sir, I do." The colonel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Then why?" Vance's eyes met his, steady, unflinching. "Because she's human, sir." And she said, "Yes." For a moment, even the colonel didn't know what to say. He pushed the file aside. "God help you, son," he muttered. Outside, the air shimmered with heat. Beyond the fence line, the women's P.O.W. compound baked under the Texas sun. The camp dogs barked, a dust devil twisting through the road, and somewhere far off, a harmonica played a slow, lonely tune. Vance had met her 6 months earlier. Elsa Werner, a German translator from Munich, captured with a group of Wehrmacht auxiliaries. She wasn't what he'd imagined when they said enemy. She didn't sneer or curse, didn't wear defiance like armor. She carried herself with quiet dignity, even when handed a mop or a shovel. He'd first noticed her when she corrected his German during ration inventory. "It's Kaffee, not Kartoffel," she'd said gently. He'd laughed. "Guess I'll have to keep learning, ma'am." That small exchange became a habit, then a ritual, then something more. In the interrogation room, Vance's mind wandered back to those moments, the ones that made no sense on paper, but explained everything in the heart. He remembered the first time she'd laughed, really laughed, when he tripped over his own German trying to ask if she liked horses. He remembered how she'd helped a sick prisoner by giving up her own bread. He remembered the night he'd seen her through the fence, bathed in moonlight, humming Home on the Range, with a faint accent that made the song sound new. And then he remembered the day he broke the rule, the day he carved the ring. It had taken him hours, shaping a scrap of aircraft aluminum into a rough circle, polishing it with a rag until it gleamed. He'd hidden it in his boot for days, waiting for the right moment. When the evening came, the sky burned red and gold, the air smelling faintly of mesquite and rain. He found her near the fence where she always stood during shift change. "I ain't supposed to give you this," he'd said quietly. She'd frowned, curious. "What is it?" He slipped the ring through the gap in the wire. A piece of something broken, made into something that might last. She stared at it, her lips trembling. "You can't," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but I had to." And then she did something neither of them planned. She said, "Yes." Back in the present, the colonel snapped the file shut. "Private Vance," he said slowly, "you understand this could end your career?" Vance nodded once. "Yes, sir." "And for what?" Vance looked down at his scarred hands. "For something worth remembering." That night, as the guards patrolled the silent camp, whispers moved through the barracks. The cowboy had asked a German prisoner to marry him. Some laughed, some cursed, others just shook their heads. And in the women's compound, Elsa sat on her bunk, staring at the small silver ring hidden in her fist. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, and somewhere in the dark, the sound of boots echoed down the corridor. The U.S. Army was coming. When the trucks arrived, the Texas sun was already climbing, burning away the morning haze that clung to the horizon. Dust rose in thick clouds as the convoy rolled past the gates of Camp Hearn, each truck packed with uniformed figures. Not men this time, but women. It was 1,944. The war still raged across Europe. But here, in the heart of Texas, another quiet front existed. Rows of barbed wire, watchtowers, and barracks filled with prisoners who had never imagined they'd end up half a world away. The guards had been told to expect German female auxiliaries, clerks, nurses, radio operators, and secretaries from the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht. Many were barely older than the boys who guarded them. Private Silas Vance stood near the gate, hat tilted against the glare. He was 24, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like a man used to horses, not rifles. To him, this wasn't war anymore. It was babysitting strangers behind fences. When the tailgate of the first truck dropped, silence followed. 30 women climbed down, their grey uniforms stiff with dust. Their faces were pale from travel and fear, but what caught Vance's attention wasn't arrogance or hatred. It was exhaustion. They looked like people who had run out of war. One woman stumbled as she stepped off the truck. Vance moved before thinking, catching her by the elbow. "You all right, ma'am?" She froze, eyes wide, then in halting English, "You call prisoner ma'am?" He smiled faintly. "Where I'm from, everyone's ma'am, till they prove otherwise." That was how he met Elsa Werner, 22, Munich-born, former translator for a Luftwaffe logistics unit. Her eyes were calm but watchful, like someone who had learned to measure every word before speaking it. Inside the camp, the women were assigned to separate barracks divided from the men by double fences. The army, still reeling from propaganda fears, enforced strict discipline. No mingling, no favors, no exceptions. But Camp Hearn wasn't what they had expected. The women had braced for cruelty, for punishment. Instead, they found clean barracks, running water, medical care, and even a mess hall that served meat twice a week. One prisoner whispered, "This cannot be war. This must be a trick." Another muttered, "America fights with too much kindness." Vance watched them adjust to camp life. They planted flowers near the laundry. They organized small concerts, sewing contests, even lectures on literature. It was strange. These were supposed to be enemies, yet they made the place feel alive. Sometimes Vance walked his patrol near the women's section at dusk. He could hear them singing old German folk songs mixed with soft laughter. It reminded him of home, of voices around a campfire. For a few moments, he forgot which side of the fence he stood on. One evening, while checking the perimeter, he found Elsa sitting near the wire, sketching something in the dirt with a stick. "What's that?" he asked. "A horse," she said simply. He laughed. "Don't look much like one." "Then perhaps you teach me," she said, smiling just enough for him to forget the fence between them. From that day on, he lingered near her sector more often, long enough to exchange a word, sometimes a joke. She corrected his German when he tried to pronounce her name, and he told her how the stars looked different in Texas than in Europe. And for a moment, in that forgotten corner of a global war, they became something else. Not guard and prisoner, not enemy and enemy, but two young people caught in a place neither of them had chosen. By autumn of 1944, life inside Camp Hearn had found its rhythm. A strange harmony built on discipline, routine, and the quiet hum of survival. The war in Europe still raged, but here, behind the Texas fences, time seemed to stretch differently. The desert wind carried the scent of dust, cattle, and mesquite instead of gunpowder. Each morning, a bugle sounded at 6 a.m. The prisoners rose, lined up for roll call, then headed to their assigned duties. For every hour worked, they earned 10 cents in canteen credit, enough to buy soap, sewing needles, even chocolate. The guards moved through the camp with practiced indifference, but over time, indifference turned into a kind of mutual recognition. The prisoners followed the rules, and the guards, many of them farmers or mechanics before the war, began to see not enemies, but people just like them. Private Vance was one of those guards. To him, the camp wasn't a battlefield. It was a ranch with fences and people who needed tending. He had stopped calling them the Germans weeks ago. Now they were the ladies, the cooks, the workers. Elsa Werner was one of the translators assigned to the administrative office. She sorted mail, logged work assignments, and interpreted letters written by POWs, hoping to contact families back home. Vance saw her often, always at a distance, always under watch. Sometimes she sat by the fence in the evening, sketching in a small notebook, always careful not to be noticed. One day, she called out as he passed. "Private Vance," she said in careful English. "What does this mean?" She pointed to a canteen label, "Pure Texas Spring Water." He grinned. "Means it's just water, ma'am. We Texans like to brag about everything, even water." She smiled faintly. "In Germany, we brag about nothing, even when we should." He tipped his hat. "Guess that's why we get along." That small exchange became the start of something the army would have called too familiar. But inside the camp, where lines blurred between captor and captive, familiarity became survival. The women tended a vegetable garden. The army allowed them to keep. They painted murals on the mess hall walls, scenes of forests and lakes that reminded them of home. On Sundays, the chaplain held open-air services for both prisoners and guards. Hymns drifted through the fences, German and English, blending into something unexpectedly peaceful. Vance began bringing his guitar on night watch, strumming quiet cowboy ballads while the camp settled into silence. One evening, as the stars came out, a few soft voices joined him from the other side of the fence, women singing in harmony, their accents wrapping around the English words. It became a ritual. He'd play, they'd listen. Sometimes Elsa would hum along, barely audible over the night breeze. Rumors spread among the guards. Some laughed it off. Others warned, "You're getting too close." "Vance," he shrugged. "Ain't no law against music." But deep down, he knew the line was thinner than he wanted to admit, and so did Elsa. She kept her sketches hidden, her letters unmailed. Yet every night, when the wind carried the sound of a lone guitar through the camp, she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that not everything in this war was lost. By winter, the fences at Camp Hearn no longer looked like barriers. They looked like borders between two different kinds of loneliness. Private Silas Vance had stopped pretending not to see Elsa Werner. Her section was along his patrol route, and every evening when the last light dipped below the horizon, they would find excuses to exchange a few quiet words. But under the routine, something unspoken had begun to form, something neither of them could define nor deny. The camp had rules, and Vance knew them by heart. No personal contact, no gifts, no letters. The penalties were clear: court-martial, imprisonment, dishonor. Yet rules didn't change the simple fact that the human heart is terrible at obeying orders. One afternoon, Elsa was helping unload supplies at the mess hall. She struggled with a heavy crate. Vance, passing by, stepped in without thinking. "Careful," he said, lifting it easily. She blinked, surprised. "You help prisoners now? Guess I help folks who look like they're about to drop something on their foot." She laughed, the sound sharp, honest, startling even to her. "You're not supposed to talk to me." "Then stop talking back." The crate landed safely on the table, but something else had been dropped between them, a weight neither could ignore. That night, Vance slipped a small package through the fence, a piece of bread wrapped in wax paper, and a cigarette tucked beside it, a foolish risk, a simple kindness. Elsa found it the next morning and whispered, "Thank you." When she saw him on patrol, he shook his head. "Don't thank me. Just eat it before someone catches you." Over the next few weeks, small gestures began to replace words. A torn sleeve mended with careful stitches, a drawing tucked into the fence post, a horse, crude but heartfelt, a leaf pressed between 2 pages of an English dictionary. When he passed by her work detail one morning, she said softly, "You are not like the others." He answered without thinking, "Neither are you." It was simple, dangerous, real, but in a place built on suspicion, even tenderness had spies. A guard named Sergeant Hollis, a by-the-book man from Ohio, began watching Vance too closely. He saw the way the cowboy lingered near the women's fence. He noticed the way Elsa looked up when Vance passed, and he didn't like it. One evening, Hollis pulled Vance aside. "Word to the wise, cowboy," he muttered. "You keep looking that way, and the brass will start asking questions." Vance kept his tone calm. "Ain't done anything wrong." Hollis smirked. "Not yet, but when you do, they'll hang you by your boots." Vance walked away without answering, but the warning stuck. That night, he wrote a line in his pocket journal, a habit he'd picked up from his mother. "They say war turns men into beasts. Maybe it's the peace between wars that turns us back." The next day, he saw Elsa again by the fence. She was humming softly, hair caught by the wind, sunlight flickering off the wire between them. He wanted to tell her what the sergeant had said. He wanted to tell her he couldn't risk it. Instead, he said, "The wind's changing. Might be rain tomorrow." She smiled. "Then maybe it will wash this place clean." That night, as thunder rolled over the Texas plains, Vance sat on his bunk, staring at the scrap of metal he'd hidden in his footlocker, a small piece of aircraft fuselage he'd found in the maintenance shed. It gleamed faintly in the lantern light. He didn't know it yet, but that scrap would soon become a ring. The Texas spring came early that year. The fields outside Camp Hearn turned green, wildflowers pushing through the dust, and for the first time in months, the air carried the scent of life instead of smoke. But inside the camp, the tension between Silas Vance and Elsa Werner had reached a breaking point. Vance told himself every morning and every night that what he felt wasn't love, that it couldn't be, that it shouldn't be. But love doesn't ask for permission, and war doesn't wait for the right time. The other guards noticed the change. He laughed less, talked less. He kept his patrols short and his answers shorter. Anna noticed it too. She'd grown quiet, her sketches fewer, her steps slower. The others teased her gently, calling her the cowboy's poet. She didn't deny it. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned the color of lead. Thunder cracked over the flatlands, and lightning clawed at the wire fences. Vance stood guard near the women's compound, his raincoat plastered to his shoulders, his boots sinking into mud. He could see her silhouette by the barracks window, unmoving, arms crossed, eyes on him through the rain. He walked closer until he could almost hear her voice through the storm. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. He shook his head. "Then stop looking at me like that." She smiled sadly. "I can't." The lightning flashed again, and for a moment they saw each other clearly. Two people on opposite sides of everything. Then darkness swallowed them again. The next day Vance couldn't stay away. He brought a book, an old tattered English primer from the camp library. He passed it through the fence when no one was watching. "Thought you might like this," he said. She took it carefully, her fingers brushing his. "You risk too much," he shrugged. "Ain't the first time." Inside the book, she later found a note on a torn ration slip. "If I'd met you anywhere but here, I'd have asked you to dance." The words hit harder than any confession. She didn't reply, but the next morning when he walked past the laundry, she dropped something from her apron pocket, a folded scrap of paper. He found it later on his route, a sketch of a cowboy hat, and beneath it, in neat German handwriting, "In einer anderen Zeit, wie leicht." In another time, perhaps. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat on his bunk, with the rain tapping the roof, and stared at the piece of metal he'd been keeping, that dull, curved scrap from a wrecked aircraft. He polished it for hours, running the cloth over and over until it shone. He didn't know why he was doing it. Maybe because fixing things was what he understood. Maybe because it felt like building something out of all this wreckage. When the morning came, the rain had stopped. The world smelled new again. Vance walked out to the fence and found her waiting. He didn't speak. He just held out the piece of metal shaped roughly into a circle. "A ring?" she asked in disbelief. "Don't mean anything official." He said, "Just means I'd have asked." She held it tight, her fingers trembling. "You can't. They'll see." He smiled faintly. "Then don't let 'em." She didn't answer. Her silence was enough. But the world doesn't leave moments like that alone for long. From the watchtower, someone saw the exchange, the glint of metal, the gesture, and before dusk, a report was already on a sergeant's desk. By the time the report reached the camp commandant, rumors had already spread. The cowboy had given a prisoner a ring. He'd promised to marry her after the war. Truth didn't matter. Vance was called to the administrative office the next morning. He stood stiffly before Captain Harlan, a lean officer with grey eyes that could strip a man bare. The captain tossed a sheet of paper across the desk. "You want to tell me what this is?" Vance glanced down. The report was brief, clinical, guard observed. Private interacting inappropriately with female P. O.W. Possible exchange of object through security fence. He met the captain's stare. "Just handed her a book, sir." "Then what's this about a ring?" "A misunderstanding." Harlan leaned back in his chair. "This camp's not a movie, Vance. You keep your distance. You know that, right?" "Yes, sir." "Then, let's not have this conversation again." The meeting ended there, but the damage was done. The other guards began watching him differently. To them, it was just gossip. To Vance, it was the beginning of something he couldn't undo. That night, he saw Elsa again, her face pale under the lantern light. "They talked to you," she said quietly. He nodded. "Someone saw us. I told them it was nothing. I know, but they'll keep watching." She hesitated. "Then don't come here anymore." He smiled faintly. "You think I can do that?" She looked away, eyes wet. "You shouldn't risk your life for a moment," he said. "Maybe some moments are worth the risk." There was a long silence. Then she reached through the fence and took his hand. The wire cut lightly into their skin, but neither pulled away. For a few seconds, the world shrank to that single point of contact, calloused fingers against trembling ones, barbed wire biting the space between them. "Do you believe in fate?" she whispered. He thought for a moment. "No, but I believe some things are too real to be accidents." She smiled. "Then Silas Vance, what would you do if this fence disappeared right now?" He took a slow breath. "I'd ask you to marry me." The words came out without hesitation, quiet but steady. She froze. "Marry?" She repeated. "You can't even touch my hand without bleeding." "Then I guess I'll bleed for a while," he said. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You Americans are impossible." He grinned. "We prefer stubborn." That night, she didn't sleep. She kept the small metal ring hidden beneath her pillow, tracing its rough edges over and over. For the first time since her capture, she felt something dangerous. Hope. Days passed. The rumors quieted, but Captain Harlan hadn't forgotten. He ordered new boundaries. No guard was to linger near the women's section without a partner. No contact beyond official duties. Vance kept his distance, at least for a while. But distance doesn't erase connection. It just makes it burn deeper. Then one evening near sunset, he saw her again near the fence. She didn't speak. She just held up a piece of paper for him to see. 3 words written in English, block letters. "I would have said yes." For a long moment, he stood there, speechless. Then he tipped his hat and whispered to the wind, "Guess that's all I needed to know." But what neither of them could see was Sergeant Hollis in the tower, binoculars in hand, watching every word pass between them. And by morning, the army would know too. By dawn, the camp wasn't quiet anymore. The morning bugle hadn't even finished echoing before 2 MPs walked into the barracks and ordered Vance outside. No explanation, just the sharp bark of military authority. He knew before they said a word. They led him to the command office where Captain Harlan sat behind his desk, the report already open. Beside him stood Sergeant Hollis, smug, arms folded, jaw set like a man who'd waited weeks for this moment. "Private Vance," Harlan began, voice clipped. "You're accused of violating direct orders concerning fraternization with prisoners of war. You understand the gravity of that?" "Yes, sir." "Did you pass any items through the fence?" "A book once." "Anything else?" "No, sir." Harlan leaned forward. "We've got testimony that says otherwise. A ring, a message, maybe even a proposal." He let the words hang in the air. "Is that true?" Vance didn't answer. There was no way to explain something that made no sense outside the fence. The captain's tone softened, almost weary. "Do you understand what this looks like, son? You're not just disobeying orders. You're compromising the uniform you wear." Vance's jaw tightened. "I didn't compromise anything, sir. I treated her like a person. That's all." Harlan sighed. "That's the problem. She's not supposed to be one to you." Outside the office, the heat was rising. The whole camp seemed to sense the shift in the air. They caught him, the cowboy and the German girl. Elsa didn't hear until that afternoon. Her translator, a kind older woman named Greta, broke the news. "The guard, you know, the one with the hat, they've taken him." Elsa's hands trembled. "Why?" "They say, for you." That night, she sat by the fence waiting for him, but he didn't come. Only the shadows did. In the barracks, Vance sat on his bunk while Hollis hovered nearby. "You think you're some kind of hero," the sergeant muttered. "You think they'll remember your little love story when this is over." Vance looked up. "Maybe they won't, but I will." The next morning, he stood in front of a makeshift tribunal. When asked if he had anything to say, Vance took a long breath and looked the captain square in the eye. "I've seen enough hate to last a lifetime," he said. "I watched men kill strangers because someone told them to. I won't apologize for showing a little kindness. Not to her, not to anyone. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, quietly, Harlan said, "Private Vance, you're confined to quarters until reassignment. Effective immediately." It wasn't prison, but it was exile. He spent the next 2 weeks confined to a separate section near the motor pool. But on the 13th day, while loading supplies, he found something tucked under the seat of his truck. A folded piece of cloth. Inside it, a ring. The same rough metal he'd shaped by hand, and a note written in German. "Du sagtest, du würdest bluten. Ich blut auch. You said you'd bleed for a while. I'm bleeding, too." Vance smiled faintly. For the first time in days, he felt alive again. The army might have built fences, but the heart didn't care about fences. 2 weeks later, the orders arrived. Private Silas Vance was being transferred out of Camp Hearn to another facility farther east, Camp Swift, near Bastrop. Officially, the reason was operational reassignment. Unofficially, everyone knew why. The morning he left, the air was cold, unusually crisp for Texas. He packed his duffel in silence, slipping the small note and ring into the pocket of his jacket. As he stepped out of the barracks, every sound seemed sharper. The army truck waited near the south gate. Sergeant Hollis was there, clipboard in hand. "Orders are orders," he muttered. Vance gave a quiet nod. Hollis hesitated, then said, "For what it's worth, you kept your head high." Most wouldn't. "Most wouldn't have to," Vance replied. As Vance climbed into the back of the truck, something caught his eye near the women's compound. Movement. A figure standing by the fence. He froze. Even from that distance he knew Elsa. She was out on work detail folding laundry near the wire. She wasn't supposed to be there. The guards nearby pretended not to notice. When she saw him, she dropped the basket and started walking toward the fence. Her steps were fast, desperate. Vance jumped down from the truck and took a few steps forward before one of the MPs barked, "Stay put, Private." He ignored it. They met at the fence, wind whipping dust between them. Her hair was tied back, her cheeks pale, eyes bright with fear and disbelief. "You're leaving," she said, voice trembling. He nodded. "They're moving me out." "Because of me?" He smiled faintly. "Because of what they think." She gripped the wire, her knuckles white. "Then let me say it before you go." I would have said yes. He blinked, stunned. The words she'd written before now spoken aloud. He reached out and placed his hand over hers through the fence. The barbs bit into their palms, but neither pulled away. "Then that's enough for me," he whispered. "That's all I needed." One of the guards shouted again, this time louder. The driver revved the truck's engine. Vance stepped back reluctantly. She held his gaze, memorizing him. Then, with sudden resolve, she lifted her hand and pointed toward the stables beyond the yard. For a second he didn't understand until he saw a single figure leading a brown horse along the fence. Anna gestured to him. "You love horses," she said softly. "Ride one more time." Vance hesitated, then he nodded slowly. He walked toward the horse, the MPs shouting now, but something in his stride made them stop. He swung into the saddle and turned the horse toward the horizon. Not running, not fleeing, just riding. As the sun dipped low, he looked back once more. Elsa stood there, one hand lifted, the barbed wire glowing red in the last light of day. For those few moments, everything the war, the rules, the fences disappeared. There was only a cowboy and a prisoner, divided by wire, united by everything that made them human. By the time the truck carried him away, the guards who watched said nothing. They just stood in silence, knowing they'd seen something rare, a kind of defiance that wasn't rebellion, but love, refusing to die quietly. At Camp Swift, life moved slower. For Vance, it felt like being buried alive under rules and silence. He spent long hours beneath engines, every bolt he tightened echoing the same thought. Her face at the fence, the way her voice trembled when she said, "I would have said yes." Every night, he pulled the folded paper and ring from his jacket. He'd hold them in his palm and imagine her voice again. Then he would write. The first letter began simply, "Elsa, I don't know if this will reach you, but I have to try." He filled 3 pages. Words about the sky, about how Texas sunsets burned like the horizon was bleeding, how he'd stopped hating the war the day he met her. He never sent it. He wrote another and another. By the end of the first month, he had a stack of 15 unsent letters hidden inside the lining of his footlocker. Every one ended the same way. When this is over, I'll find you. But war doesn't care for promises. In late 1945, word spread that the European camps were preparing for repatriation. Vance asked around, trying to learn whether the women from Camp Hearn were part of the first convoy. Nobody knew for sure. One night, he approached Captain Harlan, now transferred to Swift as well. "Sir, about the German women." Harlan didn't look up from his desk. "Don't, Vance. Let it be." "Sir, I just want to know if she's being sent home." "You don't need to know." "I think I do." Harlan set down his pen and stared at him, the weariness of 2 long years in his eyes. "I read your file. You broke orders, but you never broke your word. That counts for something, but you can't fix the world with good intentions, son. Sometimes all we can do is let people go." Vance left without another word. The letters stopped. Weeks later, while refueling trucks, he met a corporal who'd come from Camp Hearn. "Yeah," the man said. "They shipped out the women last month. Big convoy, guards everywhere. One of them, German nurse or something, left a note with the chaplain before she boarded. Wouldn't say who it was for." "What did it say?" Vance asked quietly. The corporal shrugged. "Just 3 words. Something about light." After the war ended, Vance was discharged in late 1946. He went home to Texas, to his family's ranch near College Station. He fixed fences, broke horses, and learned how to sleep again under an open sky. Years passed, but the ring stayed in his pocket, the letters in a box beside his bed. He never married, never forgot. And sometimes, when he rode out alone at dusk, he'd stop at the ridge and watch the sun sink over the fields, the same Texas sun she'd seen. He'd tip his hat to the horizon and whisper, "You got to see it one last time." The years turned quietly. By 1952, the old POW camps were gone, the barracks dismantled, the fences pulled down. Camp Hearn became pasture again, just open Texas grass and wind. In 1960, a letter arrived from Washington, part of a post-war archive effort, German POW, correspondence that had been confiscated for translation and never returned. Inside the envelope was a single piece of yellowed paper, folded 3 times, the ink faint but legible. It began, "To the soldier with kind eyes, they are sending us home. I don't know if I will survive what waits for us there, but you should know the light in Texas was the first time I remembered what peace felt like. If the world ever becomes gentle again, maybe we will meet under that sky. Elsa." He sat for a long time, staring at the letter. Outside the sun was setting, the same amber wash of light she had once called soft as forgiveness. He rode out that evening to the old campgrounds, now a flat stretch of grass where cattle grazed. The fence was long gone, but he knew exactly where it had stood. He dismounted and walked the line in silence. Then, reaching into his coat, he took out the small metal ring, the one she had sent back to him, the one he'd carried for 2 decades. He knelt and pressed it into the soil. "This is where it belongs," he whispered, "where it started." Years later, a local historian uncovered fragments of the camp's records. In the margin of one faded document, someone had scribbled a note beside a prisoner's name. "Often quiet. Loved horses. Repatriated. May 1946. Beside it, a second note written in different ink decades later. "Light in Texas." The story of the cowboy and the German woman became local legend. The army never confirmed it. History never recorded it. But some stories don't need recording to endure. They live where they happened, in the dust, the sky, and the silence after the sun goes down. In the end, it wasn't the war that defined either of them. It was what came after, the fragile grace of kindness when the world least deserved it. Vance's great-nephew would later find his letters, still unsent. He'd read them one by one and realized they weren't just love letters. They were proof of something America learned again and again, that compassion is the strongest act of defiance there is. Because fences can hold prisoners, but they can't hold the human heart.